This is Death or Prison, brought to you by leanonmeusa.org. The men you are about to hear have spent more than 50 years in prison. We bring you stories of hope and encouragement.
Hello and welcome to the Death or Prison podcast brought to you by leanonmeusa.org. I am Johnny Branham, and to my right, Mr. Elmo Golden, and to my left, our special guest, Kevin Sabbath.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. You've been in prison for 15 years.
Correct.
And you've visited several institutions. And when I say visited, I mean you were a resident there.
Right.
For our listeners and viewers, walk us through your early life and what led to that.
I was born in Detroit, Michigan, and during the time of my parents' separation, I moved to Atlanta, Georgia around 10 years old. I did grow up in a spiritual background. My mother was a minister, and my father believed in God as well. So once we moved to Atlanta, I started elementary school there. And starting out elementary school, I got into a little trouble in elementary school, bringing firecrackers to school and different things like that. So my mother, she recognized that, okay, you might have a little behavior issue. So she started putting me into activities so far as football and basketball, different things to keep me, active and away from, a troubled crowd. But of course, I'm here today. I obviously, went back to, getting into trouble, being around a troubled crowd. As I began to get in trouble, I began to go to a juvenile. Started out at juvenile, breaking into people's houses, kicking in people's doors, stealing, different things of that nature. And from juvenile, I started driving without a license, getting speeding tickets. So now it progressed from me being a juvenile, adolescent, to more of an adult, getting speeding tickets, like I said, violation probations, leading police on high-speed chases, different things like that, because I didn't have a driver's license. Well, once I graduated high school, prior to me graduating high school, let me back up, I ran away from home. Went and got involved in the streets, hanging around with the older crowd. 13,
what age was that? I was going to ask you.
I ran away from home probably around 13 years old. Right, and I didn't want to abide by the rules in my mom's house. So mom said, look, either you abide by my rules or you got to go. And when she went to work, I said, you know what, I'm just not going to abide by the rules. And I left. And I never went back home, even to this day. So during the course of me being out in the streets, hanging out with adults, I started drinking. I started smoking marijuana. And then I started being introduced to people that taught me the crime that ended up leading up to me getting 15 years, and which is fraud. I started making driver license, social security cards, birth certificates to acquire money. And I started doing income tax fraud. Once I started doing that started bringing in more money. So now when you start getting money, in a lucrative point, it starts to draw many different types of people as well. So now I done graduated from drinking to smoking weed. Now I'm doing cocaine. I'm doing party drugs. Hanging around and associating with the wrong individuals.
How old were you then, though, when you started doing the party drugs or the heavier drugs?
The heavier drugs, I'm going to say about 18, 19 years old. And then from there, I'm still going to school. That was one thing that I was determined to do, was to finish my education.
Now, I always hear about stories about children and they're living on the street or they're not. How did you survive? Because that's something that I think people are curious about at 13. How do you survive on the streets?
Well, I wasn't homeless.
Okay.
When I ran away from home, I had a friend's house that I could go to. And what I do is, I would bounce from house to house to house to house, just not wear out my welcome, so to speak. I was still out there, in the streets. And I started hanging out with the wrong crowds. And me hanging out with the wrong crowds ended up leading to drugs, which was still my choice, but it was presented by this group of people. And so once I started doing drugs, I got addicted to drugs. So now I'm spending more money as I'm hustling in the streets, doing income tax, making driver's license for people. making Social Security cards and birth certificates and different things of that nature. I'm doing this now to feed my drug habit. The more money I'm making, the more drugs, the more partying. And it got to a point that I just got so bored of going to clubs within my city. So I started flying out of town to go to clubs, friends and everything with me. It got to a point that I had to be stopped. I grew up, like I said, in a religious household. And my mother continued to pray. Even when I ran away from home, even when I was out in the streets, even when I was flying, going to this club, going to that club, my mother was still praying for me. She would call me and ask me, "Are you all right? Do you need anything?" And of course, by me being stubborn, thinking that I'm grown, no, I'm good. I'm good. Knowing that I'm not good, but of course, I'm not going to let her know that I'm good.
When you say you had to stop or something had to stop, was that something inward or was that a series of circumstances? Sometimes for people, it's a series of circumstances. Other times it's an inward voice that says you need to stop. Which one was it for you?
Well, how deep in my foolishness I was, an inner voice wasn't going to get it. It had to happen in the physical realm. I had to be removed from the streets in order for my life to be saved, number one, but also for me to fulfill the purpose that God has for me.
Kevin, most of the activity that you're talking about, it happened in the city of Atlanta?
Of course it did, because it happened during the time of me growing up. And I grew up in Atlanta, went to high school in Atlanta, and also furthered my education in college in Atlanta as well.
College?
Yeah. And that's when I really became proficient with making the driver license and identification, because you have a lot of students that are in college that are not able to go to different clubs because they're not old enough. So that's when that came into play of me actually making IDs for other people. I normally just did it for myself. It was just a personal thing. But then once, ideas from other people, look, man, you can make them for, and charge them this, that. And that's what I did. And like I said, it supported, later on down the road, that money that I was accumulating, it supported my drug habit. Even during the time that I was doing income tax fraud, I was always good at math, dealing with numbers, and just coming up, being a visionary, in the wrong aspect, not in the right aspect, but in the wrong aspect. I could sit and just come up with ideas on how to generate a profit illegally. And I utilized the intellect that God gave me, and I misapplied it to doing things for Satan, to build his kingdom, because a lot of people that I was making IDs for, they weren't old enough to get into clubs, to drink, or to buy alcohol. But these are the things that I was giving them so that they can go out and do these things. So it was a work for Satan. It wasn't a work for God that I was doing.
Who are the people that you provided the income tax services for?
It was random people. And how, without going into too much detail, there was a database that I can get information off of. And if someone calls and say, "Look, man, I want, you do income tax for me." Okay, well, you deposit a check, you give me half, and you take your half. And I would get random people's information and make fraudulent documents, Social Security cards, birth certificates, IDs. And once you get those documents, you can do anything. Once you're able to forge those documents, you're able to take over that person's identity. So you can call me and no, I may not use your income tax. I may use someone else's in another state. I never dealt with people in my state. I always utilized people. Even when I was making driver license, I would utilize people from other states and use other state driver license instead of the state that you were within. I was getting random people's information and generating income tax from them.
We kind of overlook those gifts that we have. We talk about perverting those gifts.
Of course.
How did you feel? I mean, during this whole course, how did you feel? You said you had to be stopped. How did you feel inside doing these things? Was you felt comfortable committing those crimes?
Prior to me getting caught, I felt comfortable. That's why I kept doing it. I felt like I couldn't get caught. Even though my grandmother, I went to church one day and my grandmother, she looked at me and she just stood up in the middle of church and said, "Look, boy," she's like, "you gonna go to prison for a long, long time if you don't stop your foolishness." And it came to pass. And at the time, I didn't see it coming. So I kept going. I kept doing it. you know, and it came to pass, ended up catching up with me. But at its appointed time. At its appointed time. And what I mean by at its appointed time is that everything, when God has his hand on you, everything is by his design. You can only go so far before he wheels you back in. You may think that you done got away. You done got loose. You out there. Can't nothing stop you. But when God has his hand on you, he's going to draw you back to him. And because of the calling that I have on my life is so profound, God didn't take my life in the midst of my foolishness. He set me aside.
Kevin, after you left Atlanta, you moved to Florida, and you were sentenced to 25.3 months, and you requested a furlough.
Correct.
What happened after that?
Well, I didn't move to Florida. I never was a resident of Florida. I came down to Florida just for the sole principle of committing a crime. And what I came down, my mission in Florida was to purchase high-end vehicles and have them transported, across seas to receive, money for the value of the car. That's what my charges were: fraudulent use of person identification information, 5 counts of that, and scheme to defraud, organized fraud, because it was three or four of us that came down here to do that. And after that, when I caught the charge, I stayed in the county jail for 6 months. I finally was able to bond out. I went back to Atlanta because I was living in Atlanta at the time. And I was fighting my case back and forth while I was living in Atlanta, fighting the case with Florida. When they finally came to an agreement with the state, said they're going to give me 25.3 months, I came back down to Florida to sign that plea agreement. That's when I asked for the furlough. And the judge agreed to let me go, contingent upon that if I did not return, then I could be facing the maximum penalty of the charge. I didn't have no intentions on coming back anyway. When I asked the question, I already knew when she told me, I just can't see, I'm not going to sit in no prison for 25.3 months. I got a lot of stuff I could be doing. Then my mind started playing tricks. The devil started playing, man, look at all that money you're going to be missing. 25.3 months, boy, everything going to go down. Your whole little enterprise is going to go down. I mean, I ain't going to prison for 25.3 months. Left out the courtroom, I got in the car with my aunt. And my aunt said, you got to come back now in 30 days. I told her, I'm not coming back. I went back to Atlanta. I stayed in Atlanta probably 4 or 5 months because they kept resetting my court date. They didn't file a bench warrant at the time, but they kept resetting. When they filed the bench warrant and began to go to different relatives' house in Atlanta, that's when I said, you know what, I need to go to California. So I left to go to California in January. And by July, they had caught me to extradite me back to Florida from Los Angeles.
When you were in L.A., when you were in California, who did you live with? I mean, what happened? How did that happen?
When they came to my condo, a bounty hunter came to my condo in Atlanta. And by me being in that type of business I was in with fraud, you live a very paranoid life. You don't have friends. You don't have people that come to your house. So I had all these cameras and stuff set up on the outside of the condo. And I seen this guy that does not look like he live in the area coming down the steps. Well, my condo is the only condo on that floor. So when he began to run down the steps, by me being paranoid like I was, something's not right. So I grabbed my phone, so I jumped out the window, and sure enough, it was the bounty hunter. So I told my girlfriend at the time, I said, look, go ahead and pack up everything, and I'm going to call the movers to move the stuff out, and we're going to go ahead and fly to Atlanta. We're going to fly to L.A. And that's when I left Atlanta that day and went straight to L.A. Once I got to L.A., I didn't want people to know that I was in town because my mother was also the type of person that don't tell me nothing, because if they ask me, I'm not going to lie for you. So it's best that I don't know where you at, where you living at, or any of those things. So I didn't let people know that I had arrived in L.A. I made it to L.A. with $300 in my pocket because I end up at the airport, I end up having to drive there to L.A. from Atlanta. So once I got into L.A., I got a hotel room. I got my laptop, my printer. I went and printed some payroll checks. I went and cashed them at different, places, locations that cash payroll checks. So I was able to accumulate some money then. So then I moved out to Pomona. They was doing a rent special on one of the apartments. You get 2 months rent free. So, okay, I need them 2 months. So once I moved out to Pomona, I began to look for a job because I have to, have a job so that I can continue to get this information that I need to, hustle. But I'm able to learn the business quick. And once again, I applied what God gave me. I applied it for the benefit of Satan. When they caught me in California, I was working up under another name, living up under another name. It was no way that they could have found me but God. They went to my parents' house, went to my father's house, couldn't locate me. And they kept telling my mom, your son is extremely good because when we think we have him, he gets right away from us. I had perpetrated to be an accountant. And this was some of the things that I used to do as well. I would study a profession. And once I studied a profession, I would go and apply for the job and create my resume to match the needs of this business. And of course, I'm going to be working in the financial industry, okay, because I need people's information, to be able to perpetrate my fraud. So I will learn whatever job I needed to learn to be able to get and maneuver into different industries so that I can retain people's information to continue to keep my enterprise going on. And I was sitting in my office and I got up and went to the secretary and I said, look, I'm getting ready to go outside for a second. Just send all my calls to my voicemail. She said, you need to go back to your office. I said, what? She said, you need to go back to your office. So as soon as she said that, the president of the company looked, and they were standing on the side of the door, and I couldn't see who they were talking to. But when she looked at me, the officer, the U.S. Marshal, turned around the corner, and he looked, and he saw me. He walked up to me. He said, what is your name? And the name that I was living up under at that time, I gave him that name. He said, he opened up a portfolio, a black portfolio, and he said, is this you right here? And it was a picture of me from Florida, my mugshot in Florida. I said, yes, it is. He said, well, guess what? He said, we don't have to make no big scene. It don't have to be no confusion. We're just going to escort you downstairs, and you already know what's going on. I said, yes, I do. And they arrested me and extradited me back to Florida. When I get to my court date, I go before the judge for sentencing, and she imposed a 15-year sentence onto me, and it was a shock because it was a big jump from 25.3 months, which I was expecting to get, all the way to 15 years.
You've been listening to the Death or Prison podcast brought to you by leanonmeusa.org. I am Johnny Branham. To my right, Mr. Elmo Golden. You have been listening to Mr. Kevin Sabbath's story. There is much, much more to tell. Be tuning in next week for it. We say, choose life.
Lean on Me USA, in partnership with Alpha USA, wants to connect you to a welcoming church. To begin a new life, call 314-607-8850.
I can change the world. Feed one, teach one boy and girl. Maybe we can change the world.